I was in Billings, Montana when it happened. March 18th, 2027. A normal Tuesday night. I remember that because I had just finished a double shift at St. Vincent Healthcare where I worked as a night nurse. I was on my way home, barely keeping my eyes open, just a couple of miles from my apartment on the west side of town. The streets were mostly empty. The sky was clear, cold. That eerie silence that comes right before dawn. And then, my phone buzzed. Not a call. Not a text. That sound. That awful, jarring, piercing sound. The kind of sound that forces your entire body into high alert before your brain even catches up. The kind of sound that means something very, very bad is happening. Emergency alert, extreme radiation detected. Seek immediate shelter. I nearly slammed on my brakes in the middle of the road. I glanced at the notification, half expecting it to be a mistake, some kind of technical glitch. But my gut told me otherwise. I looked up, scanning the empty streets, the dark buildings, the sky. I expected to see something. A flash. A plume. Something. But there was nothing. Just the wind whistling through the cracked windshield of my old Subaru. I flipped on the radio. Static. Every station. Just that low, humming static that made the hairs on my arms stand up. My hands clenched the wheel, my breath coming out in short, sharp bursts. And then the siren started. Not the usual ones. Not the distant wail of an ambulance or the sharp blare of a police cruiser speeding down 27th Street. No, these were different. Deeper. Louder. It felt like they were inside my bones, vibrating my ribs, rattling the fillings in my teeth. I was only a mile from my apartment. I could make it if I drove fast enough. But then I saw something that made my stomach drop. A man. Standing in the middle of the road. Just standing there. He wasn't moving. His back was to me. He was wearing jeans, a flannel, boots. Typical Montana guy. But there was something off about the way he stood. Too stiff. Too still. His arms hung at his sides like dead weight. His head was tilted slightly, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. The sirens kept wailing. I honked my horn. He didn't move. I checked my mirrors, about to swerve around him when he turned his head. Just his head. His body didn't move at all. That was when I saw his face. Or what was left of it. His skin was wrong. Blistered. Dark patches peeling away. His eyes were milky, unfocused. His mouth hung open, his lips cracked and bleeding. And then, he smiled. A deep, toothy grin. Too wide. Too deliberate. I didn't think. I floored it. My tires squealed as I swerved around him, barely missing his outstretched fingers. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see what he did next. I reached my apartment in under a minute, screeched into the parking lot, bolted up the stairs. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the lock. Once I was inside, I locked every door, bolted the windows, pulled the blinds. My heart pounded in my ears, drowning out the sirens. Then, my phone buzzed again. Emergency alert, do not attempt to leave shelter. Do not engage with affected individuals. Await further instructions. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in sharp, shallow gasps. My mind raced. Radiation? Ow! From where? A bomb? A leak? Had something happened at Yellowstone? And then I noticed something I should have seen before. My skin. My arms were red. Like a sunburn that had appeared out of nowhere. Burning. Tingling. Spreading. And outside, the sirens wailed louder. I stumbled back, barely able to process what I was seeing. My arms, it wasn't just redness anymore. The skin looked angry, almost swollen, and a rash was creeping up my wrists, spidering in thin, branching patterns. It itched, but worse than that, it burned. Like a heat lamp pressed against my flesh. I grabbed my phone with trembling fingers, flipping on the flashlight. My reflection in the dark window stared back at me, wide eyes, dilated pupils, sweat beading on my forehead. I pulled up my sleeve. The rash was spreading. A creeping sickness, inching its way up my body, and I had no idea what it meant. I wasn't alone. The apartment above me, footsteps. Frantic. Pacing. Something heavy being dragged. A chair? A body? The muffled thump of hurried movement made my pulse quicken, but before I could make sense of it, there was a knock at my door. It wasn't a normal knock. Soft. Deliberate. I held my breath. Another knock came, louder this time, vibrating the wood slightly in the silence of my apartment. My legs moved on their own, slow and careful, as I crept toward the peephole, my heartbeat slamming against my ribs. I didn't want to look. I had to look. I pressed my eye to the peephole. Nothing. No one was there, just the dimly lit hallway outside, flickering fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The hair on my arms stood up. My ears strained to hear something, anything, that could explain what was happening. Then another knock, but this time it came from behind me. I spun around. It came from the bathroom. My skin prickled, my fingers tightening around my phone as I took a slow step forward. My apartment was small, a one-bedroom, just a cramped kitchen, a tiny bathroom, and the living room. There was no way in. The only window in the bathroom was sealed shut, the lock rusted over since I moved in. Another knock, followed by a slow, deliberate scratching. It wasn't random, not the way pipes groan or furniture shifts. It was rhythmic, like nails dragging against the wood in careful, deliberate strokes. I moved toward the door, barely breathing, fingers gripping the handle. It wasn't locked. It hadn't even been closed earlier. I left it half open when I ran inside. But now it was shut. I pressed my ear against it, listening. Silence. Then, another slow, drawn-out scrape along the other side. My mind raced, cycling through possibilities. It wasn't possible. I had been alone when I got here. No one could have gotten in. Unless something had already been here. My phone buzzed in my hand. Emergency alert. Symptoms include rash, dizziness, confusion. Do not attempt to leave shelter. Do not open doors. Remain inside. My breath caught in my throat. The rash. I had the rash. I was one of the symptoms now, and I didn't even know what that meant. My thoughts were spinning when the sound of metal clicking made my blood run cold. The bathroom door handle was turning. A slow, creaking twist, like someone testing it from the inside. That was it. That was enough. I ran. Bolted for the front door, fumbled with the lock. My hands were slick with sweat. I yanked it open and nearly fell into the hallway, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. And then I realized I wasn't alone. The neighbor from 3B, Mr. Dalton, was standing there. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring down the hallway, his face slack, frozen. His eyes were wide, unfocused, his lips moving in quick, soundless murmurs. I followed his gaze toward the stairwell. The door was open. And in the darkness beyond it, something was standing there. It wasn't a person. Not anymore. It was moving wrong. Twisting, its limbs jerking at unnatural angles, like a marionette with cut strings. The lights flickered, and for a split second, I saw its face. Burned. Warped. Melted. Its mouth stretched into a grin, too wide, too many teeth. My muscles locked in place as the realization set in. This thing, whatever it was watching us. Then it took a step toward us. Mr. Dalton let out a sound, a choked, gasping wheeze. His skin was red, blistering before my eyes, and as his lips cracked open, he whispered something in a rasp so thin I barely caught it. They see us. The lights flickered again. And then it started running. Straight for us. I didn't think. My body acted on instinct, slamming the door behind me as I sprinted back inside my apartment. I locked it, bolted it, dragged the couch in front of it, my pulse hammering so fast it made my vision blur. Outside, the sound of footsteps, no, not footsteps, something heavier, something irregular, pounded against the floor. The hallway lights flickered again, casting long, jerky shadows under the doorframe. Mr. Dalton made a sound I can only describe as a choked whimper, and then he screamed. It wasn't a normal scream. It was cut short. A wet, gurgling noise. A sudden, brutal thud. The walls shuddered from the impact. Then silence. I clamped a hand over my mouth, backing away. My stomach churned. The metallic tang of bile rose in my throat. My body was shaking too hard to stop it. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. I got on my hands and knees and inched toward the peephole, just enough to get a glimpse. Mr. Dalton was on the floor. His body was wrong. His legs bent sideways at the knee, his arms sprawled unnaturally. His eyes were open, glassy, lips still parted mid-scream. His skin had peeled away in places, as if he had been left under a scorching sun for days. And then I saw the thing that had done it. It wasn't running anymore. It was crouched next to him, watching. Its head jerked in tiny, unnatural motions, its melted grin widening as it reached out and pressed 2 fingers against his throat. It was checking, making sure he was dead. My stomach clenched. My breath came in short, shallow bursts. The thing twitched its head, like it had just heard something behind it. Then, slowly, so slowly, it turned its head toward my door. It knew. I scrambled back from the peephole, barely holding in a sob. The thing in the hallway knew I was in here. I heard the wet sound of movement, something dragging against the floor. I threw myself behind the couch, pulling my knees to my chest. My chest heaved. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay silent. And then, a knock. The same soft, deliberate knock I had heard earlier. The same knock that had come from the bathroom. I squeezed my eyes shut. If I didn't move, if I didn't make a sound, maybe it would go away. My phone buzzed in my lap, and I nearly threw it across the room in terror. My fingers shook as I lifted it, slowly, carefully, praying the sound hadn't been loud enough to draw its attention. Emergency alert, do not respond to unfamiliar voices. Do not open doors for anyone. Do not leave shelter. Remain inside. Something scraped against my doorframe. My throat tightened. The thing outside was still there. I heard it breathe. Not normal breathing, but ragged, uneven gasps, like it was trying to remember how. The smell hit me next. Burnt hair. Melted plastic. A deep, sickly sweet stench of decay. Then, for the first time, I heard its voice. A whisper, so thin it barely reached through the door. Let me in. It sounded wrong. Like a recording being played back at the wrong speed, warping and stretching. My hands dug into my scalp, nails pressing into my skin, willing myself to not move. The whisper came again. I can hear you. A single tap against the door. You're breathing. My body went rigid. I was breathing too hard. My own panicked gasps felt like they were shaking the entire apartment. I pressed my palm over my mouth, shutting my eyes as something heavy leaned against the door. It wasn't leaving. It knew I was in here. It was waiting. And then, my phone buzzed again. Emergency alert, secondary threat detected. Do not attempt to leave shelter. Signal interference may occur. Remain calm. I barely had time to process what that meant before the lights went out. Total, suffocating darkness. And outside my door, the whispering stopped. The second the lights went out, the air in the apartment thickened. The only sound was my own breathing, ragged and uneven, my hands clenched so tightly that my nails bit into my palms. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare even think too loudly. Something was still outside the door, its presence like a weight pressing against my chest, suffocating, smothering. I strained to listen, but the only thing I could hear was the distant, high-pitched hum of the emergency sirens still wailing somewhere in the city. Then, something shifted. Not inside. Outside. A noise, low and distant, like static rolling over a dead radio frequency. The sound grew, rising and falling in waves, a distorted signal cutting in and out of existence. My phone vibrated again, the glow from the screen the only sliver of light in the room. I hesitated, knowing that whatever was outside might see it if I moved, but the dread in my gut told me I needed to look. Emergency alert, signal interruption detected. Stay indoors. Do not attempt communications. Do not respond to unfamiliar transmissions. I barely had time to process what that meant before the whispering started again. Not from the door this time. From the window. I nearly knocked over the coffee table, scrambling back, my mind scrambling to understand how that was possible. I was on the second floor. There was nothing outside that window except an empty alley and a rusted fire escape I had never once seen used. But something was there now. The sound was different than before, fainter, warped, like a voice struggling to form words through a mouth that had forgotten how. Help me. A soft tap against the glass. My chest tightened. I didn't look. I wouldn't look. Please, it's inside. Let me in. The voice was wrong. Not just because it was coming from the second-story window. It was familiar. My stomach twisted into knots as I realized why. It was Mr. Dalton. No. No, that wasn't possible. I had seen him die. I had seen his body twisted, broken, drained. Another tap against the glass, harder this time. They're coming. Please, I don't want to die. A shudder rolled down my spine. My body screamed at me to stay down, stay hidden, don't move. But my mind was already unraveling, trying to grasp what was happening. The emergency alerts had warned me not to respond. But how could they have known? How could they have known exactly what was going to happen before it did? I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The thing at the window let out a low, slow exhale. Then it laughed. Not fully. Just the edges of a laugh, a cracking, broken sound, as if the attempt at human expression had been poorly rehearsed. The glass creaked. I squeezed my eyes shut, my pulse pounding against my skull. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. The air changed. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel the shift. The presence at the window was gone. The presence at the door, gone. Even the suffocating pressure in the room had lifted. Something had changed. For the first time in what felt like hours, I let out a slow, controlled breath. My fingers ached from gripping my knees too tightly. I glanced at my phone, trying to ignore how clammy my palms had gotten. No new alerts. That should have made me feel safer, but instead, it made the anxiety dig deeper. I needed to know what was happening. Carefully, I crawled toward the window. I didn't look out. I wasn't stupid, but I pressed my ear against the cold glass, listening for anything. Silence. Then, faintly, from somewhere far in the distance, a voice. Not a whisper this time. Not a mimicry. A real voice. Is anyone receiving this transmission? If you are still alive, please respond. The words were distorted, cutting in and out, but the desperation in the tone was clear. Someone else was alive. Someone else was trying to reach out. I shouldn't have. I should have listened to the alerts. But my hands were already moving, grabbing the emergency radio from the drawer. The city had emergency broadcast frequencies in case of disaster. I switched through them, listening to nothing but static, static, static. And then, a voice. Any survivors in the Billings area, please respond. We have secured a safe zone at The signal cut out. The radio hissed. And then, through the static, something else spoke. Not a voice. Not human. We see you. The lights flickered back on. The radio died. And somewhere outside, in the blackness beyond my window, something knocked. The knock at the window sent a fresh wave of panic through me. My body locked up, muscles tight, refusing to move, refusing to breathe. I knew I couldn't look. I knew I shouldn't look. But my body had other ideas. Slowly, I turned my head toward the glass, my pulse hammering so hard it felt like my ribs would crack under the weight of it. There was nothing there. Just the alley below, empty, silent. Just the rusted fire escape, unmoved. Just the reflection of my own terrified face staring back at me, the dim glow on my phone screen casting my features in pale light. Then my phone buzzed again. Emergency alert, do not engage with transmissions. Remain indoors. Secondary exposure risk increasing. Seek immediate indoor shelter. The words sent a cold, sick feeling down my spine. Secondary exposure? Did they mean the rash? Did they mean something worse? I looked down at my arms, heart racing. The redness had deepened. The veins beneath my skin looked darker, almost black, spidering in fine, jagged lines. I felt hot, feverish, like my insides were simmering just below the surface. A sound cut through the silence. Not from my window. Not from the hallway. From outside. Deep, mechanical sirens. Not the emergency broadcast kind. Not the normal citywide warnings. This was something else. A long, droning wail stretching over the city, vibrating through the glass, pressing against my skull. It wasn't coming from one source. It was coming from several. I grabbed my radio again, fumbling with the dial, trying to find that voice again. Someone had been there. Someone had called out for survivors. But as I flipped through static, a different noise broke through the white noise. Click. 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 I froze. The Geiger counter. Not mine. I didn't own one. But the sound was unmistakable. A rapid-fire series of sharp, pulsing clicks, growing faster, stronger, closer. And then the whispering returned. It wasn't at my window anymore. It wasn't at my door. It was inside the apartment. I turned my head so slowly it felt like time had fractured, splintering into jagged seconds. The apartment was dark, only lit by the weak, blinking glow of the streetlights outside. My breath hitched. My hands clenched into fists. The whispering was behind me, near the kitchen, growing softer, closer, wrapping around the space like a humid fog. Then, a shadow moved. Not a flicker. Not a trick of the light. Something shifted. I lunged for my bedroom door, my hand slamming into the knob just as the whispering stopped. The air went thick, heavy, like the apartment itself had exhaled. Then the light changed. Not from the street. Not from my phone. From underneath the door. A dull, unnatural glow spilled in from the hallway, a deep red, pulsing like a heartbeat. I knew that light. I had seen it before. In the hospital. Before I could stop myself, memories came flooding back. The ER last week. The two burn victims that had been rushed in from an accident near the outskirts of town. The way their skin had peeled away in sheets, their eyes glazed, their mouths moving without sound. They hadn't lasted long. Their bodies gave out before we could even identify what had happened to them. I had tried to convince myself it was just another shift, just another emergency. But now, standing in my dark apartment, watching that same unnatural red glow pulse beneath my door, I knew the truth. This had started before tonight. And I had already been exposed. The sirens outside grew louder. The Geiger counter in the static clicked faster. And then, footsteps. Not from outside. Not from the hallway. From the other side of my bedroom door. Slow. Deliberate. Something was inside my apartment. Something was standing outside my door. Waiting. I backed away, pressing myself against the far wall, my lungs burning with the effort of keeping silent. The red light beneath the door grew stronger, stretching long, jagged shadows across the floorboards. Then, a hand. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. A real hand, blackened, blistered, pressing against the floor, fingers twitching. It was crawling under the door. The moment I moved, the thing on the other side reacted. The whispering came back, sharp, eager, laughing. The Geiger counter on the radio spiked. The sirens outside roared. And the door handle turned. The door handle twisted, slow and controlled, not frantic or searching, but deliberate. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering, breath caught in my throat. The Geiger counter from the radio crackled in the background, a steady clicking rhythm climbing faster and faster, like a countdown I couldn't stop. The thing on the other side of the door was patient. It wasn't trying to force its way in. It wasn't pounding or clawing. It knew I had nowhere to go. Then it spoke, not in a whisper this time, not in that thin, distorted voice from before, but clear, a low, rattling exhale of syllables, warped like a radio transmission barely cutting through a dying signal. "You let us in." I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body screaming to not respond. The emergency alerts had said it, over and over: do not engage. Do not open doors. Do not respond to unfamiliar voices. A pause. Then, the voice changed. "Please, open up." My stomach clenched as my nails dug into my palms. I knew that voice. I knew it because I had heard it hours ago on my way home from work. "Mr. Dalton. I need help." The voice trembled, cracked. "I don't know what's happening, man. Something's wrong with me." I forced myself to stay still, my pulse slamming in my ears. "I think I got burned or something. It hurts. Jesus, it hurts." The air in the room thickened, and I stared at the red glow beneath the door, my fingers twitching against the floor. My instinct screamed at me to move, to run, to do something, but I had seen Dalton's body in the hallway. He was dead. And the thing outside my door knew that I knew. The red glow flickered, the Geiger counter spiked, and then the voice dropped. "You saw, didn't you?" My skin went cold. The thing on the other side of the door let out a slow, guttural chuckle. It knew I had seen what happened to Dalton. It knew I was trapped in here. It knew that sooner or later, I would have to make a choice, open the door, or wait for whatever was coming next. The door shuddered, the wood groaned as something pressed against it. Not a fist. Not a body. Something else. Something larger. And then, all at once, the lights in the apartment flickered back on. The red glow vanished. The Geiger counter cut to silence. The sirens outside stopped. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't understand what had just happened. The entire apartment was deadly quiet, the only sound my own shaking breath. I stared at the door, at the floor beneath it, at the place where I had just seen that hand. It was gone. I stayed there for what felt like hours, knees pulled to my chest, waiting for the whispering to return, for the shadows to stretch back under the door. But nothing happened. Slowly, my body uncoiled, my fingers unclenched from where they had dug into my arms. Then my phone vibrated again. I lifted it with shaking hands. Emergency alert, radiation levels fluctuating. Signals intermittent. Remain indoors. Threat still active. I blinked at the words, my thoughts a haze. Fluctuating? What did that mean? Had the radiation stopped? Or had it moved? I forced myself to my feet, every muscle aching with tension, and pressed my ear against the door, listening. The hallway was silent. I had to check. I knew it was stupid. I knew the emergency alerts had told me to stay inside. But there was a voice on the radio earlier, a survivor. A safe zone. If I stayed here, I'd die either from the radiation or from whatever was inside my apartment earlier. Slowly, carefully, I moved the couch away from the door, unbolted the lock, pressed my fingers against the handle, and then, with a slow breath, I turned it. The hallway was empty. I took a cautious step out, the air thick with dust, the scent of burnt plastic and copper still clinging to the walls. The body, Dalton's body, was gone. A dark smear of something blackened the floor where he had been, but there was no sign of him. I forced myself forward, legs shaking, thoughts spinning, breath coming too fast. I needed to get downstairs. I needed to get out of this building. I turned toward the stairwell, and that's when I saw outside. For the first time since I locked myself inside, I could see the world beyond the apartment complex. And it was wrong. Billings was gone. The street outside was bare. Buildings that had stood for decades were half melted, warped, twisted like wax. The road was cracked, uneven, the pavement bubbling in places like something had burned through it from below. Storefronts were hollowed out husks, windows shattered, structures sagging inward as if they had been partially liquefied. But the worst part, the thing that made my stomach drop, made my knees threaten to give out, there were people. Standing in the streets. They weren't moving. Hundreds of them, scattered across the melted cityscape, their backs turned, their bodies still, stiff, frozen. Their clothes were intact, untouched, but their skin, I swallowed hard. It wasn't skin anymore. It was blackened, petrified, like they had been flash burned in an instant and left standing in place. A man in a suit. A woman in jogging clothes. A teenager with a backpack slung over one shoulder. Statues. Frozen in time. My breath hitched in my throat as, all at once, they turned their heads. Not the way people turn. Not gradual, not smooth. It was sharp, unnatural, every single head rotating toward me in eerie synchronization. Their eyes, deep, empty sockets where the burn had hollowed them out, locked onto me. And in perfect, collective unison, they smiled. I didn't move. My legs locked up, my breath caught in my throat, and my mind screamed at me to turn, to run, to do anything but stand here frozen, staring at the hollow-eyed things that had once been people. Their smiles stretched too wide, their mouths splitting through burned, blackened flesh that had hardened like cooling wax. The silence in the city stretched too long, a vacuum of noise where there should have been wind, the distant hum of traffic, the echo of life. But there was nothing, just the figures standing in the street, just their unmoving limbs, just the static grin carved into each of their faces. Then, all at once, they moved. Not by walking. Not by shifting forward in any way that made sense. They snapped toward me, all of them, a sudden, jerking lurch, closing the distance in an instant. One moment they were half a block away, and the next they were at the base of my building. Their heads were tilted up, their sockets still locked onto me. I staggered backward from the window, bile rising in my throat. The second my feet scraped the floor, their necks twitched at the sound, their heads jerking violently, tracking my movement without blinking, without breathing. The nausea in my stomach churned like something inside of me was boiling. I could hear my own breath coming too fast, ragged and unsteady, and I clamped a hand over my mouth, desperate to keep silent. It didn't matter. They had heard me anyway. The nearest one, a man in what looked like the tattered remains of a business suit, took the first step forward, but his legs didn't bend. He didn't walk. His whole body tilted forward at the ankles, toppling like a dead tree. But before he could hit the ground, he caught himself. His limbs cracked, snapped into place, bending the wrong way, straightening out like something stiff being worked loose. Then, suddenly, he was running. Not just him. All of them. The entire street of burned, grinning people lurched into movement, bodies jarring, limbs twitching, necks craning too far back as they sprinted toward my building. They were fast. Too fast. They reached the lobby in seconds, their footsteps nothing but a whisper against the ruined pavement. The moment they disappeared from view, I turned and ran. I slammed through the apartment door, my hands slick on the doorknob and my breath ragged in my throat. I locked it behind me. Not that it would matter. I had seen what these things could do. The bolt wouldn't stop them. Nothing would. The building shook as something slammed into the front entrance. The walls trembled, dust spilling from the ceiling. They were inside. My chest burned. My head felt like it was swimming. I stumbled, catching myself against the wall. The rash on my arms had deepened into something worse, veins blackened, spreading in jagged streaks under my skin, creeping higher toward my shoulders. My stomach lurched, nausea curling in my gut, and when I reached up to wipe the sweat from my brow, my fingers came away red. Blood. From my nose. I had to move. My legs barely obeyed. The sickness made them weak, unsteady, and the sound of them was getting closer. The whispering started again, but this time it was everywhere. Not just in the hall. Not just at the door. Inside the walls. Inside my head. I made it to the stairwell, gripping the rusted railing as I half ran, half stumbled down the concrete steps, my shoulders slamming against the walls. The lights flickered, casting my shadow in warped, twisted streaks against the stairs. My vision blurred. My body burned. The Geiger counter in my pocket had gone silent, but I didn't know if that meant the radiation was gone or if it had gotten so bad that the device had just given up. A crash above me. They had reached my floor. I pushed myself harder. The voices weren't whispers anymore. They were laughter, warped and static-filled, like voices cutting in and out of an old radio. Each syllable was distorted, stretched, garbled beyond recognition. My head pulsed in time with it, a headache burrowing deep behind my eyes. Then, the red glow returned. It started at the base of the stairwell. A thin, pulsing light, creeping along the cracked linoleum like liquid seeping through the foundation. It pooled at the bottom, stretching long tendrils up the walls, crawling toward me. I had seen that glow before. It meant they were coming. The lobby was just below me, but something moved in the red light. A figure, half hidden in the dark, standing just past the last set of stairs. For a breathless second, I thought it was another one of the burned people, another grinning husk. But as I hesitated, my fingers clenched against the railing, the figure lifted its head. It wasn't one of them. It was a man. His face was still human. His eyes were wide, frantic, darting to the stairwell above me. He held something in his hand, a rifle. His lips moved, mouthing something I couldn't hear over the ringing in my ears. Then he lifted his other arm, waving me forward, urgency carved into every inch of his expression. A survivor. He was a survivor. Then his expression changed. His eyes flicked past me, his entire body going rigid, his lips parting in horror. I didn't turn. I didn't need to. I felt it. The heat. The light. The whisper against my ear. I lunged forward, throwing myself down the last set of stairs as something slammed into the wall behind me. My shoulder hit the ground hard, pain lancing through my arm. The man grabbed me, dragging me through the lobby doors, and suddenly I was outside, the air cold and sharp, the burning heat of the building left behind. We didn't stop. Didn't look back. The entire city stretched out before us, warped, broken, streets full of silent, unmoving figures. The man shoved something into my hands, a gas mask. "You're contaminated," he said, his voice tight, breathless. "We need to move. Now." The red glow spilled out into the streets behind us. And the whispers followed. The man pulled me forward, yanking me through the streets as my legs barely kept up. My entire body felt like it was on fire, the rash spreading up my arms and over my chest, creeping toward my throat. My head pulsed with each hurried step, and my breath came in ragged gasps, barely getting enough oxygen to keep moving. The gas mask in my hands felt heavy, the rubber pressing against my fingers, and I forced myself to lift it, slipping it over my face. The stale, chemical-tinted air filled my lungs, but it was better than the alternative. We ran. The city was in ruins. Every building was twisted, half-melted, warped into itself like wax left too close to an open flame. Cars lined the streets, but they weren't crashed. They weren't abandoned mid-drive like you'd expect in a disaster. They were parked, neatly, perfectly, as if the people inside had just stepped away for a moment. But there were no people. No bodies. Just the figures in the streets, the ones that still stood. They weren't chasing us. They were watching. Their heads turned in eerie synchronization as we passed, empty sockets following our every movement. Their lips were stretched into smiles, fixed and unmoving, frozen mid-expression as though something had pressed them into shape and left them that way. They didn't breathe. They didn't twitch. They only stared. The red glow behind us spilled over the pavement, seeping from the doorways, creeping from the alleyways, chasing us like a slow-moving tide. It didn't rush forward, but it spread, like it had all the time in the world, like it knew we had nowhere to go. My legs felt weak. I wasn't going to last much longer. The man leading me, he hadn't stopped. He was strong, fast, controlled. His grip on my arm was firm, but I could tell he was holding back, slowing himself just enough to keep me from collapsing. His gas mask obscured most of his face, but his eyes, sharp, focused, alive, told me enough. He knew something I didn't. We took a hard turn down an alley, sprinting past the rusted-out skeletons of dumpsters and abandoned storefronts. The buildings were blackened, hollowed, like the insides had been scooped out and left to rot. Something about them felt wrong. We weren't alone. I could feel it. The second we hit the next street, the man slowed, his grip on my arm tightening. He was searching, watching, waiting for something. The red glow had stopped creeping forward, hovering just at the edges of the alley, like it wasn't allowed to pass. Then I heard it. A buzzing. Not mechanical. Not an electrical hum or the faint whine of failing streetlights. A Geiger counter. Somewhere ahead, behind the shattered remains of an old department store, a light flickered. It wasn't red. It was white. A bright, sterile fluorescence spilling from the edges of a metal doorway that had no reason to be there. The moment my guide saw it, his grip on my arm tightened. "That's it," he said. My throat was dry. My mind was spinning, my vision dark at the edges, but I forced myself to focus. What? My voice was hoarse, barely more than a breath. The shelter. Shelter. My pulse spiked. The alert. The transmission. The voice on the radio. They had been talking about this. I turned to look behind us, back toward the ruined cityscape, and my stomach dropped. The figures in the street had moved. They weren't standing still anymore. They were closer. Not running. Not lunging forward in a sprint like they had before. They were drifting. Their feet scraped against the pavement in slow, shuffling drags, their limbs stiff, their bodies tilting forward, their empty sockets still locked onto us. The red glow pulsed in time with their movement, stretching long, twisting fingers of light between their shifting forms. The man didn't wait. He dragged me toward the metal doorway, shoving through the narrow opening, hauling me inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. The smell of burnt plastic and decay vanished. The whispering in my head stopped. The warmth on my skin, the radiation, the sickness, the heat, it dulled, like a pressure valve had been released. The door slammed shut behind us. For the first time in hours, I could hear nothing. No sirens. No static. No whispers. Just silence. The man let go of me, stepping back. The bright overhead fluorescence hummed, cold and sterile. The walls were smooth, metal, reinforced. Not the kind of shelter you'd find in a city like this. Not a bunker. Something else. The man removed his mask. I barely registered his face before my legs gave out. The last thing I heard was his voice, clear and steady. "You got exposed. We need to contain it before it spreads." Then, darkness. Darkness held me in its grip for what felt like hours. Maybe days. Time lost meaning in the black, where my body was weightless, my thoughts slow and heavy, like my mind had been sunk beneath thick, suffocating tar. There were moments when I thought I could hear something, low murmurs, the scrape of something metallic, the distant pulse of a Geiger counter clicking too fast. But the sounds faded in and out, slipping away before I could catch them. Then, suddenly, I woke up. Cold. That was the first thing I noticed. The air was cold, unnaturally so, like the inside of a hospital room kept just a few degrees too low. I tried to move, but my arms wouldn't respond at first. My fingers twitched uselessly, stiff and weak, as though they had forgotten how to work. My body felt heavy, sluggish, my limbs foreign. I was strapped to something. Panic surged through me, cutting through the grogginess in my brain. I tried to sit up, but restraints held my wrists and ankles down, firm but not painful. The room around me was bright, painfully white, illuminated by sterile overhead lights that cast no shadows. The walls were smooth metal, curved at the edges like a tunnel. There were no windows. Then I heard the voice. "You're awake." It was him. The man from before. My blurry vision sharpened, and I turned my head toward the sound. He stood near the far wall, no longer wearing the heavy coat and gas mask. His clothes were clean, military style, no insignia, no name tag. His face was tired, sharp features set in something grim, unreadable. My throat was raw, my voice barely a whisper. "The safe zone," he said. "Underground facility, 30 miles outside Billings." He stepped closer, arms crossed. "You're lucky. We don't usually recover people this late in the exposure cycle." Exposure. The word sent a jolt through me, and suddenly, everything came rushing back. The figures in the street, their frozen grins, the way they moved, the red glow crawling through the city. My arms burned at the memory, and I forced my head down, looking at my skin, expecting to see it blackened, charred, falling apart. But it was clean. No rash. No darkened veins. No sign of the sickness that had been spreading through me. "What did you?" I coughed, my throat clenching. "What happened to me?" The man exhaled, rubbing the bridge of his nose. For the first time, he didn't look like a soldier. He looked tired. Like he had been doing this too long. "You were contaminated," he said. "The radiation, it's not like what you're thinking. It's not just fallout, not just ionizing particles. It's something else." I stared at him. "What do you mean something else?" He hesitated. Then he moved to the side, pressing something into the wall. A screen flickered to life, a monitor displaying a map, an aerial view of Billings, glowing in shades of red and orange. The hottest zone was at the center, pulsing like a wound. "This isn't a normal event," he said. "It started 3 days ago. We picked up the first anomalies on satellite. Radiation spikes, patterns we couldn't explain. It wasn't a bomb. Wasn't a meltdown. It was," his jaw tightened, "something else." The monitor changed, flickering through thermal images, street after street of standing figures, still as statues, their heat signatures gone. They weren't people anymore. Not by any biological standard. The first wave was instant, he continued. "We don't know what triggered it. The second was slower, people like you. People who were caught in the field but didn't burn right away. You had about 8 hours before," he trailed off, watching my expression. "Before I became one of them." I swallowed hard, my skin crawling. "And you stopped it?" "For now," he said, but there was something in his voice that made my stomach tighten. I looked down at my hands again. They looked normal. They didn't feel normal. My body still felt wrong. My veins itched, like something had been stripped out of them and hadn't fully healed. I forced myself to meet his gaze. "What happened to them?" He didn't blink. "They aren't alive." I shook my head. "That's not what I asked." Silence stretched between us. Finally, he exhaled. "They're not dead, either. Not in the way you'd think." He gestured to the monitor, where the streets of Billings still pulsed with unmoving figures. "The radiation changed something at the molecular level. We don't know if they can still think, if they're aware, but we do know they react to the living." I thought about the way they turned their heads, the way they moved, the way they smiled. "What about me?" I whispered. His expression hardened. "You're still human," he said carefully. "For now." I stared at him, dread creeping up my spine. "For now." The restraints around my wrists and ankles weren't just for safety. They were watching me, studying me, waiting to see if I would change. A new sound filled the air, an alarm, shrill and sharp. The man's head snapped toward the monitor, and his entire posture stiffened. The map had changed. The red zone was moving. It was expanding. The man swore under his breath, slamming his fist against the console. "It's not supposed to be this fast," he muttered. "The field is still spreading." He turned back to me, his expression suddenly colder, more calculating. "How much do you remember?" The question caught me off guard. "What?" "From before we found you." His voice was firm now, demanding. "You weren't just exposed. You saw something. We need to know what." The whispering. The way it had slithered into my skull, stretching my thoughts thin like pulled taffy. The way the figures moved, their smiles twisting with something unnatural, something wrong. The red glow in the stairwell. The thing that had spoken to me. The thing that had touched me. I met his gaze. "I don't think it's just radiation." My own voice sounded far away. "I think it's alive." For the first time, his mask of control cracked. The lights above us flickered. And somewhere deep underground, beneath layers of reinforced steel and concrete, I heard something knock.